I guess I want to report just really quickly the case, what went on, in the last couple months leading up to what happened this week. So, Cecily McMillan is a young social democratic activist. She is the Northeast Regional Organizer of the Democratic Socialists of America. She was involved in the Wisconsin uprising in 2011, when the unions took over the Capitol prior to Occupy Wall Street. And she was a leader of the Occupy Wall Street movement when the occupation of Zuccotti Park took place. She was actually profiled in Rolling Stone magazine, where they characterized her as one of the more they described her as the right wing of Occupy Wall Street, because she was always raising that they have demands like free health care and education, and she was always very vocal that they should not engage in what they called diversity of tactics, and she always was pushing nonviolence. So what happened, the court case began with an incident that took place on the 6-month anniversary of the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations on March 17th of 2012. That was when the Left Forum was happening near Zuccotti Park at Pace University, and Michael Moore was speaking at the end of his talk. Michael Moore urged people to go down to the park and have a 6-month celebration of the Occupy demonstrations. So a whole bunch of people did go down to the park, and Cecily McMillan herself was actually not planning to occupy the park that night. She was actually, it was St. Patrick's Day. March 17th is also St. Patrick's Day, and she was celebrating, wearing a bright green dress, having drinks with friends. And between going, when she heard there were arrests happening at the park, she went down to the park. And when she was there, Officer Anthony Bovell was near the park also as people were being arrested, and he was not wearing his police officer's uniform. In fact, he was wearing normal clothes with his officer's jacket, which he was wearing inside out, so that the logos were not on display. And he saw Cecily. He claimed she was having an argument with somebody. Regardless, he walked up to her and he grabbed her breast. He grabbed her from behind and grabbed her breast very violently. So, not knowing what had happened, Cecily jumped in reaction and did this. The elbow went up, and it's on tape. The elbow went up. At that point, she was then picked up. Officer Anthony Bovell picked her up over his head, threw her into the ground, and began to beat on her, handcuffed her. She was handcuffed. She was put with the other arrestees, and then she began to have a seizure. She began having a seizure and began having seizures, and a friend of ours named Jen Waller was one of the arrestees also, and the arrestees were mic checking, demanding that she be given medical attention. EMTs showed up to give her help, and the NYPD blocked them from getting to her as she was there on the ground writhing and having a seizure. So that was the arrest, and while most of the people that were arrested that night had the charges dropped against them or were given an ACD or whatnot, she was charged with assault on a police officer in the 2nd degree, which is a felony in the state of New York. So flash forward 2 years, the trial took place, and it received quite a bit of coverage. I mean, it was in the New York Times before the trial began. It was all over all kinds of media. And I sat in the courtroom on a couple different occasions during the jury selection, during her testimony, during some other parts. She did not in any conceivable way receive a fair trial. The officer who assaulted her has a history of brutality against Occupy Wall Street protesters. The city has actually paid out settlements for his other acts of brutality, but none of that was allowed. The jury was not allowed to hear that. The jury was not allowed to hear any of the evidence of police brutality against Occupy Wall Street protesters. In addition, much of the medical evidence about how Cecily McMillan had been beaten up was not allowed to be shown to the jury. All of the, so much of the evidence that came out, including the very famous picture of, of the handprint that Officer Bovell left on her breast, the shape of a hand. He squeezed her so hard he did that. That was not allowed to be seen by the jury. Things were just not allowed to be seen by the jury. And so after, and she had a very good lawyer, Martin Stoller, a leader of the National Lawyers Guild. I mean, did an excellent job defending as well as he could in a very hostile courtroom. But she was convicted and found guilty. Now, usually when someone's convicted of a felony, they're allowed to then wait until their sentencing to be taken off to jail. Well, what happened in the courtroom after she was convicted was very much a staged event designed to intimidate and scare people. There had been a whole bunch of Occupy people, 40 to 50 Occupy people at the trial every single day. Well, when the verdict came down, the courtroom was filled with 38 cops. All right, and as the Occupy people were coming in, more and more cops started piling in. There was something like over 50 cops were in the courtroom at the time they were announcing the verdict. And the courtroom is full of all of these cops. They announce that she's been found guilty. Then they announce they will not be granting bail. They'll be taking her to prison immediately, to Rikers Island, awaiting sentencing. They cuff her in the courtroom and drag her off. And then as people from the Occupy movement are standing up in the courtroom, then there's scuffles in the courtroom. It was a very, very dramatic, staged event of intimidation. And you want to talk about how much of an unfair trial this was. In the closing argument that the prosecution made, the prosecutor, Amy Choi, she said in her closing argument, Cecily McMillan says she was beaten up by the police, but she said she might as well have said she was beaten up by space aliens. Right? I mean, the jury, that's how, the fact that Amy Choi was able to make that argument shows how much any talk of police brutality was completely eliminated from the trial. So since the trial, now that she's in Rikers Island awaiting sentencing on May 19th, now that she's, since the trial, 9 of the 12 jurors have actually come forward and said they don't think she should go to jail. And one of the jurors gave an interview and was just, I mean, the jury was not able to see the facts of the case. This was not a fair trial in any conceivable sense of the word. So, you know, this is getting a lot of publicity. A lot of different forces have come out to support Cecily McMillan and others. And you know, it's important to put this in the context of what's going on. Occupy Wall Street was really a sign of the economic times. As people don't have jobs, people, you know, the economy gets worse. People are going to want to protest and want to do something about it. And as a result, you know, there's been a crackdown against these forces that have demonstrated, not just here in the U.S., but also in Europe, in Turkey, and elsewhere. And you know, if we want to talk about this analytically, we'll talk about, you know, the so-called civil liberties that exist in the United States are based on the plunder and murder of millions of people. Black and brown people in the United States have never had freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or any of the liberties that have existed. And in a time of economic crisis, the capitalist state becomes much more defensive and begins to engage in these kind of things. And I just wanted to quote briefly, you know, it's not exactly fascism, the rise in the police state we're seeing, but it is a ratcheting up of the repression that people have to face. And Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist International in 1935, spoke about why these things happen. And he said, "The imperialist circles are trying to shift the whole burden of the crisis onto the shoulders of working people. That is why they need fascism. They're trying to solve the problems of the markets by enslaving the weak nations. That is why, and intensifying colonial oppression and repatritioning the world anew by means of war. And that is why they need fascism. They are striving to forestall the growth of forces of revolution by smashing revolutionary movements of the workers and the peasants. And that is why they need fascism. The capitalists are very much bracing for the uprising that they know is coming. And they're trying to intimidate us. I'm going to wrap up, but I just want to say, essentially, they targeted this woman because, number one, because she was a leader of the Occupy movement. Number two, because she was a moderate. So, you know, she was a moderate. She wasn't some you know, black bloc anarchist engaging in armed activities. Number three, because she was innocent. You got to imagine a mafia don, you know, saying to somebody, "Oh, sure, you can go protest, but if a cop grabs you and you jump and you go to jail for 7 years, you know, that's what they're trying to say. The message is, you go out and protest, something might happen, you might go to jail." She's facing 2 to 7 years in prison. But the message has to be very clear that people will not be intimidated, and people are saying that they will not be intimidated. There are calls for mass demonstrations on May 19th when the sentencing is happening. There's call for more and more demonstrations on Sunday. FIST, with a youth group, before we show the film Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners, we're having a speak out in Union Square, and we will be raising the case. We need to be out in the streets and make clear they're not going to intimidate people from protesting and demonstrating, that we are going to be just as loud as we were before, and that this whole attempt to frighten and terrorize people out of demonstrating and rising up and protesting, it will not work. So that's the key. Thank you.